My parents refused to care for my newborn twins during my emergency surgery, called me a burden, and went to a concert instead. I never imagined the people who raised me would abandon me at the most vulnerable moment of my life. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, holding my phone with hands that would not stop shaking. My body was still weak from the pregnancy, and the pain had been getting worse every day. The doctor had made it clear that the surgery could not wait. If I delayed it, the risk to my health would be serious. All I needed was a few days of help with my twins. Just a few days. Evan and Noah were sleeping in their cribs, their tiny chests rising and falling in a soft rhythm. Looking at them should have made me feel calm, but instead my chest felt tight. I was scared, not just of the surgery, but of what would happen to them while I was gone. They were still so small. They needed someone they could trust. Calling my parents felt like my last safe option. We were never the kind of family that talked about feelings, but they were still my parents. I told myself that this was different. This was an emergency. This was their daughter asking for help. When my mom answered, her voice sounded impatient, like I had interrupted something important. I explained everything slowly, carefully, trying not to cry. I told her about the surgery and how the doctors insisted it had to happen right away. I told her I just needed them to stay with the babies for a short time. There was a pause on the line, and then my dad started talking. His tone was cold, almost annoyed. He said they had plans. He said they were finally enjoying their lives again. My mom sighed and said I was asking too much, that twins were exhausting, and that they were done raising children. Then came the words that still echo in my head. She called me a burden. She said my problems were not theirs anymore. I remember whispering, "Please," without even realizing I had said it out loud. I told them I was scared. I told them I had no one else. That was when my dad mentioned the concert, like it was a normal thing, like choosing music over his daughter's life made sense to him. The call ended quickly after that. No apology. No hesitation. Just silence. I sat there in the dark, listening to my babies breathe, feeling something inside me break. It wasn't just heartbreak. It was the sudden understanding that the people I thought I could rely on were never really there to begin with. In that moment, fear turned into something heavier, something that would change the way I saw my parents forever. The doctor didn't sugarcoat anything. He sat across from me with a serious face and told me the complications were getting worse. Infection, internal bleeding, risks that could turn dangerous very fast. He said waiting was not an option anymore. The surgery had to happen within days, not weeks. I nodded like I understood, but inside my mind was racing in only one direction, my babies. As soon as I got home, the reality hit me hard. Evan and Noah were still so young that they needed care almost every minute. Feedings, diapers, crying in the middle of the night. I could barely lift them some days because of the pain, and after surgery I wouldn't be able to care for them at all. I felt panic settle deep in my chest. I wasn't worried about myself as much as I was worried about what would happen to them if I couldn't be there. I started making a list of people I could ask, but the list was short. Most friends were busy with their own lives, and I didn't want to place such a heavy responsibility on anyone. My parents' name stayed at the top of my mind. Even though our relationship had always felt distant, I believed this situation would be different. These were their grandchildren. Tiny, helpless babies. Surely that would matter. Before calling, I practiced what I was going to say. I tried to keep my voice steady, even though my hands were trembling. I didn't want to sound weak or dramatic. I just wanted them to understand how serious this was. I kept telling myself that family shows up in moments like this, even if they haven't before. When I finally pressed the call button, my heart was pounding. Every ring felt louder than the last. I imagined my parents stepping in, holding the twins, telling me not to worry, telling me to focus on getting better. That image gave me a small sense of relief, even before the call was answered. As I spoke, my voice shook despite my effort to stay calm. I explained the medical situation in simple terms. I told them the doctors were worried. I told them I was scared. I made it clear that I wasn't asking for long-term help, just support while I went through surgery and recovery. I believed that once they heard how serious it was, everything else would fade away. I waited for concern. I waited for questions. I waited for reassurance. Instead, I felt the space between us grow wider with every second. Their responses felt distant, almost detached, like they were listening to a stranger's problem. I kept talking, hoping that if I explained more, they would finally understand the urgency. In my mind, this was the moment where family stepped up. This was where being a daughter and a mother mattered more than old habits or emotional distance. I truly believed that when it came down to newborn babies and a medical emergency, my parents would choose us. That belief was the only thing holding me together as I waited for their answer. The answer came fast, and it wasn't what I expected. My mom said she couldn't do it. Her voice was flat, almost annoyed. She said taking care of 2 babies would be exhausting and that she and my dad were past that stage of life. My dad agreed and added that they had already done their share of parenting. I tried to explain again, slower this time, hoping they just hadn't understood me the first time. I told them it wouldn't be forever. I said I would arrange everything, supplies, instructions, schedules. They wouldn't have to figure anything out on their own. I could hear my own voice breaking, and I hated that. I hated sounding like I was begging. My mom sighed loudly, like I was wasting her time. She said I should have thought about all this before having kids. My dad said choices have consequences, and this was mine. The words hit me one by one, sharp and heavy. It felt less like a conversation and more like a judgment. Then my mom said it. She told me I was a burden. Not just tired or overwhelmed, but a burden. She said they had raised their kids already and weren't interested in starting over. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. That word sank into me deeper than anything else she could have said. I felt my throat tighten as I tried to respond. I reminded them that I was their daughter. I reminded them that the babies were their grandchildren. I told them I wasn't asking because I wanted to, I was asking because I had no choice. My voice was barely above a whisper by then. That's when my dad casually mentioned their plans. He said they had tickets to a concert out of town. He sounded almost excited about it, like this was something I should understand. He said they wouldn't cancel something they had been looking forward to for months. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A concert. Music and lights and fun mattered more than their daughter and 2 newborn babies. I asked them to please reconsider. I said I would never forget this if they turned away from me now. I told them I was scared and needed them. There was a pause, and for a brief second, I thought maybe I had reached them. Maybe they would change their minds. Instead, my mom said she didn't want to argue anymore. She said I was being dramatic and that they had already given me their answer. My dad said I needed to figure it out on my own and stopped responding. The call ended without a goodbye. I stared at my phone, waiting for it to ring again, hoping it had all been a mistake. It didn't. The silence that followed felt louder than the words they had spoken. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about help. It was about being rejected by the very people who were supposed to protect me when I couldn't protect myself. After the call ended, I sat still for a long time, holding my phone like it might somehow change what had just happened. My face felt hot with shame. I never thought I would be the kind of person left begging for help and getting turned away. The worst part wasn't just the refusal. It was knowing I had lowered myself, trusted them, and been dismissed so easily. Panic set in quickly. I looked around the room at the cribs, the diapers stacked in the corner, the bottles drying on the counter. I tried to imagine how I could manage all of this alone after surgery, and my chest tightened. The pain in my body was already bad, and the doctor had been clear that pushing myself further could make things dangerous. I started making calls. One after another. Some people didn't answer. Others apologized and said they couldn't commit to something so intense. Every no felt heavier than the last. I began to feel foolish for even asking. My confidence disappeared with each call, replaced by embarrassment and fear. At one point, I considered postponing the surgery. I told myself maybe I could endure the pain a little longer. Maybe I could find a way to manage. But when I spoke to the medical office again, they were firm. Waiting could put my life at risk. Hearing that out loud made everything feel real and terrifying. I wasn't being dramatic. This wasn't optional. Late that night, I reached out to someone I barely knew well, a woman named Karen who lived a few blocks away. We had talked a handful of times in passing. I almost didn't send the message, afraid of another rejection. When she replied and said she could help, I stared at the screen in disbelief. She didn't ask many questions. She didn't judge. She just said she would be there. The contrast hurt more than I expected. A near stranger was willing to step in without hesitation, while my own parents had turned away without guilt. That thought stayed with me as I packed a small hospital bag, my hands shaking the entire time. On the morning of the surgery, Karen came over early. She held Evan and Noah gently, speaking to them in a soft voice. Watching someone I barely knew care for my children with such kindness broke something open inside me. I kissed their tiny foreheads, trying not to cry in front of them. At the hospital, as I was being wheeled into surgery, the tears finally came. It wasn't fear of the procedure that made me cry. It was the realization that my parents had chosen a concert over their daughter's life and their grandchildren's safety. That truth hurt more than any physical pain I was about to face. When I woke up after surgery, everything felt quiet and heavy. My body was sore, and my thoughts moved slowly, but one thing stayed clear in my mind. I kept hearing my parents' voices over and over, as if the phone call was playing on a loop. No matter how hard I tried to focus on healing, the words wouldn't leave me. Lying there, I had a lot of time to think. With nothing to distract me, memories from my childhood started to surface. Moments I had brushed off for years suddenly felt different. I remembered how praise was rare in our house and how mistakes were never forgotten. Love always felt tied to performance: do well, behave, don't need too much. I thought about how often I had been told to be strong and independent, even when I was clearly struggling. Asking for help was never encouraged. Needing support was treated like weakness. Back then, I believed that was just how families worked. Now I could see it for what it was: emotional distance disguised as discipline. The phone call wasn't an accident. It wasn't stress or bad timing. It was part of the same pattern I had lived with my entire life. When I needed them the most, they responded the same way they always had, by pulling away and blaming me for needing anything at all. That realization hurt, but it also brought clarity. I stopped wondering what I had done wrong. I stopped replaying the conversation, trying to imagine different words that might have changed their answer. The truth was simple and painful: they chose themselves, and they always had. As my body slowly began to heal, something inside me shifted. I felt calmer, but also more aware. I knew that when I left the hospital, things could not go back to the way they were before. Pretending everything was fine would only invite the same pain again. I didn't feel the urge to confront them or demand an apology. Yelling wouldn't fix what had already happened. I didn't want dramatic arguments or emotional scenes. What I wanted was control over my own life and protection for my children. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future where I didn't chase their approval. Where I didn't explain myself or justify my choices. A future where access to me and my children was not automatic, but earned through respect and care. I realized that change didn't have to be loud to be powerful. It could be quiet. It could be firm. And it could start with me deciding that being related to someone doesn't give them the right to hurt you without consequences. A few weeks after I came home, my parents showed up like nothing had happened. No warning, no serious conversation beforehand. They acted relaxed, smiling as if this was a normal visit. My mom talked about the drive over, and my dad made small jokes, the kind he always made when he wanted to avoid anything uncomfortable. They asked to see the babies right away. There was an expectation in their tone, like access to Evan and Noah was something they were owed. My mom even said it was about time they got to spend proper time with their grandchildren. I watched them carefully, noticing how easily they stepped back into the role of proud grandparents without acknowledging the past weeks at all. When the concert came up, it was mentioned casually, almost playfully. My dad joked about how crowded it was and how late they got back. My mom laughed and said it was nice to finally enjoy themselves again. They spoke like they were sharing a harmless memory, not something that had left me terrified and alone. I felt something settle inside me then. Not anger. Not tears. Just distance. I kept my voice polite and calm. I didn't argue or bring up what they had said on the phone. I didn't raise my voice or demand explanations. I answered their questions briefly and avoided sharing anything personal. I could tell they noticed the change, but neither of them asked about it. They stayed for a short time, holding the babies and talking about themselves. When they left, they seemed satisfied, as if the visit had gone exactly as they expected. As soon as the door closed, I realized how different I felt compared to before. I wasn't relieved by their visit. I wasn't comforted. Instead, I felt clear. They hadn't come to check on my recovery. They hadn't asked how I was coping. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the fear they had caused. They acted as if time alone had erased their choices, and forgiveness was automatic. That was when I understood something important. They didn't feel responsible for what they had done. They expected the relationship to reset without effort on their part. And I knew I could no longer allow that. So I didn't confront them. I didn't argue. I simply stopped reaching out. I stopped offering updates. I stopped inviting them into my life the way I used to. It wasn't revenge fueled by anger. It was protection fueled by clarity. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to them. I was choosing myself and my children, quietly and without apology. Life slowly settled into a new rhythm. I stopped waiting for my parents to check in or offer help. I stopped hoping they would suddenly understand me. Instead, I focused on building a routine that didn't depend on them at all. I arranged steady childcare, planned my days carefully, and made choices with only my children and myself in mind. It felt strange at first. For so long, I had measured my actions against what they might think or say. Without that weight, I felt lighter, but also more aware. Every decision I made came from a place of responsibility instead of fear of disappointment. Weeks passed, and the distance grew naturally. I wasn't ignoring them on purpose. I just wasn't reaching out anymore. There were fewer calls, fewer visits, and fewer updates about the twins. My life kept moving, even without their involvement. That's when they started to notice. My mom called one afternoon, her tone sharp and confused. She asked why I seemed distant. She said I had changed and accused me of being cold. My dad followed up with messages asking if something was wrong. They sounded unsettled, like they were losing control of a situation they had never expected to change. I listened without interrupting. For the first time, I didn't rush to explain myself or smooth things over. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm and steady. I told them the truth without raising it like a weapon. I said they had failed me when it mattered most. I told them I needed help during a medical emergency and they chose something else. I said that choice had consequences, even if they didn't like them. I wasn't angry when I said it. I was honest. There was silence on the other end of the line. I could tell they hadn't expected that. They tried to defend themselves, saying they didn't think it was that serious, that I was strong, that I always handled things on my own. Their excuses sounded weak, even to them. I didn't argue. I didn't debate. I just repeated that I had needed them and they weren't there. Then I ended the conversation. That was the moment the balance shifted. I no longer felt small or dependent. I wasn't asking for understanding or approval anymore. I had already accepted the truth. They realized they weren't the center of my life the way they once were. I could feel their discomfort, but it didn't control me. I had built something solid without them, and I wasn't willing to break it just to make them comfortable again. When we finally spoke again in person, there was no shouting. No dramatic scene. I didn't raise my voice or accuse them of being bad people. I simply spoke plainly. I told them what had happened, what I had asked for, and what they had chosen instead. I didn't add emotion to it. I didn't soften it either. I stated the facts and let them sit in the room. They looked surprised, almost offended, as if they hadn't expected their actions to be remembered so clearly. My mom was the first to react. She said I was being unfair and that parents aren't required to put their lives on hold forever. She reminded me of everything they had done for me growing up, listing sacrifices like they were debts I now owed. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, my dad stepped in. His tone turned sharp. He said I was overreacting and holding a grudge. He said people make mistakes and families move on. He tried to frame it as my failure to forgive, not their failure to show up. Then came denial. They claimed they didn't realize how serious it was. They said I always seemed strong, that I never needed help before. They said they thought I would figure it out, like I always did. Each excuse sounded carefully chosen to protect them from responsibility. I didn't argue with any of it. I didn't defend myself. I simply said that intention didn't erase impact. I told them trust had been damaged, and trust didn't return just because time passed. It returned through actions. They asked about the twins. They wanted to know when they could see them more often, when things would go back to normal. That's when I was clear. I said visits would be limited. I said I needed to feel safe and supported before opening that door wider. I said my children deserved consistency and care, not people who appeared only when it was convenient. The room went quiet. They hadn't expected boundaries. They hadn't expected calm resistance instead of emotional pleading. I could see it in their faces, they didn't know how to respond without control. I stood my ground. Not out of anger, but out of respect for myself. I wasn't punishing them. I was protecting my peace and my children's stability. That difference mattered. As I left, I felt steady. There was no rush of victory, no satisfaction in their discomfort. Just a quiet strength. I had chosen dignity over drama, distance over damage. And for the first time, I knew that holding firm was the most powerful response I could give. Time passed, and the distance stayed. My parents began to realize that something had truly changed. They were no longer needed in the way they once assumed they always would be. They weren't the first people I called anymore. They weren't part of the daily rhythm of my life or my children's lives. That absence slowly started to sink in. Their messages changed in tone. The confidence they once had was replaced with uncertainty. They asked more questions, not about the babies, but about me. They wanted to know if I was upset, if I was holding on to anger. It felt like they were trying to understand what they had lost without fully facing why. Eventually, they asked to talk. When we met, there was a noticeable shift. My mom looked tired. My dad spoke less than usual. This time, there were apologies, but they felt careful and incomplete. They said they were sorry if I felt hurt. They said they didn't realize how deeply it affected me. The words were there, but they stopped short of full responsibility. I listened quietly. I didn't interrupt or push them to say more. I could tell they were uncomfortable, like they were standing in unfamiliar territory. They had never been in the position of needing forgiveness before. I told them I accepted their apology. I meant it. Carrying anger wasn't something I wanted. But I also told them that acceptance didn't mean things would go back to how they were. I explained that trust had changed, and so had I. Forgiveness didn't erase memory, and it didn't rebuild closeness on its own. They struggled with that. My mom asked why forgiveness wasn't enough. My dad asked what more they were supposed to do. I answered honestly. I said I needed consistency, accountability, and time. I said closeness wasn't something I could force anymore. That's when it finally hit them. They had missed a moment they could never get back. A moment where they could have been needed, relied on, and trusted. No apology could undo that. No explanation could replace it. I could see the regret in their faces, and this time it felt real. Not because they felt guilty, but because they understood loss. They had chosen comfort over responsibility, and now they were living with the result. I didn't feel satisfied by their regret. I felt calm. I knew I had handled things the only way I could without losing myself. I had protected my children and my peace. As we parted, there was no anger between us. Just a quiet understanding that some choices change relationships forever. And while forgiveness opened the door to civility, it didn't reopen the door to the closeness we once pretended to have. Sitting in the quiet of my home, holding Evan and Noah close, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced before. The long months of fear, pain, and disappointment had left their mark, but they also brought understanding. I realized that family isn't always the people who share your last name. Sometimes, it's the people who show up when it matters, who protect, care, and love without conditions. Looking at my babies, I understood the lessons betrayal had taught me. My parents' absence during my most vulnerable moment was a painful truth, but it also gave me insight into what I would never tolerate in my life again. Love and care should be dependable, not conditional. I had seen that even those who raised you can fail when you need them most. Recognizing that allowed me to stop holding on to illusions about how people should behave. I thought about the patterns in our family. Generations of neglect, of conditional affection, could have repeated with my children if I let fear or loyalty dictate my choices. But by standing firm, by protecting myself and them, I broke that cycle. I chose to create a family defined not by obligation or past mistakes, but by trust, respect, and presence. It wasn't easy to accept that walking away from my parents' influence was necessary. Part of me wished things could have been different. Part of me grieved for the connection that never fully existed. But walking away wasn't cruelty. It was survival. It was the only way to ensure that my children and I were safe, valued, and nurtured. In the silence of the nursery, with both of them asleep in my arms, I felt a sense of strength I hadn't known before. I had survived betrayal. I had survived fear and humiliation. And through it all, I had learned that peace comes not from demanding apologies or forcing relationships, but from setting boundaries and staying true to what you need. I reflected on the choices I had made. Each difficult decision, from insisting on limited access to enforcing boundaries, to rebuilding our routines without my parents, was a step toward a life defined by dignity and clarity. It was a life where I no longer waited for validation from people who had failed me repeatedly. Holding Evan and Noah, I smiled softly. I could see a future where they grew up in an environment of love that was consistent and safe. I could see myself thriving, making decisions without guilt, and living with the knowledge that I had done what my parents never could: protect, nurture, and prioritize my children without compromise. That understanding settled deeply within me. Sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones who fail you. And sometimes the strongest choice isn't forgiveness or confrontation, it's choosing yourself, choosing your children, and stepping forward with courage. I finally felt free, knowing I had broken the cycle, built a life of safety and love, and created a future I could be proud of.